We are in a defining moment for digital humanities, due to several factors including new technologies, the ease in which everyday historians can learn the latest communication techniques, and the desire to learn in a more open and transparent way. The history field is witnessing a new era in growth and possibilities. This is one such project which has garnered praise and allowed those who are curious about the past to engage with primary sources from an era of turmoil and dramatic change. Mississippi was one of the most powerful states in the Union when it seceded and joined the Confederacy. Over the next 16 years, devastating military campaigns, revolutionary emancipation, long-term Army occupation, and groundbreaking legislation redefined the state and the nation. All this can be studied in this rich collection. This is the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Mississippi Project. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation here on the Tattooed Historian Facebook and YouTube channel. Thank you so much for being here. My name is John. I am the Tattooed Historian, and I am joined by three wonderful historians for tonight's broadcast on women and the war on the home front. First, Dr. Susanna Url is back once again. Dr. Url is a professor of history and co-director of the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society at the University of Southern Mississippi. She is the author of numerous books, articles, editorials, blog posts, columns, and digital history projects that share cutting-edge historical ideas and research with scholars, educators, and the public. Second, Dr. Stephanie Seal Walters is the USM Digital Liaison in the Humanities. Steph earned her PhD from George Mason and focused her studies on loyalism in Virginia during the American Revolution. On top of being a regular on my live streams, Steph has been a leader in the classroom when it comes to digital humanities, and she is a pug enthusiast. I'm always going to say that. I'm always going to bring
I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that.
Always going to bring that up. Our special guest tonight is Dr. Diane Sommerville. Dr. Sommerville's research interests encompass race, gender, and the American South. Her first research project, which culminated in the publication of her first book, Rape and Race in the 19th Century South, traces the evolution of white Southerners' fears of black rape by examining cases of black on white rape throughout the 19th century. A recent project, Aberration of Mind, Suicide and Suffering in the Civil War Era South, is a study of suicide among Southerners during and after the Civil War that explores how gender and race shape decisions and attitudes about suicide in the wake of war's physical and emotional devastation. Her current project is a study of postpartum disorders in the American South. Her teaching areas include the 19th century United States, the American South, U.S. women's history, Civil War and Reconstruction, history of sexuality in the United States, and African American history. So I am outnumbered this evening, and I am very happy to have you all with me here for this fantastic discussion. Thank you for joining me this evening.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Url, we're back at it again, and we're talking about a very interesting topic, which I know will appeal to many people in the audience tonight and on the future podcast. We're talking about women on the home front during the Secession crisis, during the war, and during Reconstruction. How has this all come to pass as far as shaping the narrative of the project?
Right. So, I mean, as we get through these documents, as you know, MDAH does the wonderful job of digitizing and sending them down to us, and the Mississippi Digital Library helps get all that stuff online. We're uncovering some things that you might expect from the literature, right? I mean, I think I mentioned last week, one of our assistant editors, Lindsay Peterson, sent Stephanie this great document where a woman's offering to organize a Nightingale regiment of nurses, but they do expect the pay of soldiers, and it's fantastic, right? So some of that early kind of enthusiasm. But I think, you know, two of the things that are happening as we look at the documents we're working through, and then some of the sample documents that archivists really helped me kind of find from the collection to give people a sense of what we might discover as we continue on. is this sense of frustration and anger and despair. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to have Diane join us tonight, because she gets into this so much in her book. And you're not always, I'm not seeing a lot of the image of the noble sacrifice. What's coming up in the documents is a lot of frustration and a lot of anger and a lot of just what am I going to do? That this kind of sense of just being absolutely overwhelmed. And so that's one of the things I'm going to want to explore with these documents as we get more and more transcribed. As the listeners may remember, I mean, there's 20,000 documents to get through. The first 2,000 are going to go live in June. So we're getting there. But you can see the sample documents that we'll be talking about tonight at the sample document site. But one of the things I want to explore is okay, how did we get from what we're seeing in the documents to this almost Scarlett O'Hara fighter, but perseveres, and it's all worth it for this meaningful cause? Like, we're not seeing that.
That's very interesting, because we hear about that so much. As I was growing up, I even heard about it, about women on the home front supporting 110% of the time, and there were instances where manuscripts came out, monographs did come out that said about the power of the women at home, and how that could appeal to the men on the front as far as either staying in the fight or going. But I didn't realize there was so much of the negative kind of ways of feeling towards the war effort early on, as perhaps there was, and some of the secession crisis, perhaps. I don't know. We can go through that in detail. But Diane, what have you when you see this, where women are basically trying to control the narrative? I guess you could say they're trying to be like, they have an opinion. Obviously, they have a political opinion. They live politics. But how does that echo throughout some documents that you have uncovered as well, that we may find in this project?
So I think there's an intersection of the women that I looked at and some of the women that are being uncovered in Mississippi. And that said, my women are truly the most mentally distraught, psychologically bereft. Many of them end up in insane asylums, and some of them even commit suicide. So they are, but where I see them intersecting is this point of desperation, and that's where I see some of the documents coming through, the letters to the Mississippi governors, asking for relief, demanding relief, right? So I think that it is really important to understand the dire straits that so many of these women were in, and it makes perfect sense because. And we can talk more about this notion of paternalism, but these are women who have been socialized to believe that they are dependent and they're reliant on their husbands and they're inferior. And so when the war hits and their husbands leave them, they're like, "Hey, I can't do this." And where I think we've been misled has largely been the influence of the Lost Cause acolytes, right? Because they were all about, I say in my book, they wanted their cake and eat it too. They wanted to talk about how much Confederate women suffered, how much they sacrificed, but they also wanted to talk about how resilient they were and how they persevered. And you see this throughout all of during the war and then after in the Lost Cause. I mean, I picked one quote that I think is pretty telling. Jefferson Davis, of all people, he says, when he's talking about the women of the Confederacy, he talks about them whose fortitude sustained them under all the privations to which they were subjected. In other words, they rose above it all, right? And so for a lot of years, Mary Elizabeth Massey, who wrote Bonnet Brigades, right? There is this acknowledgement of suffering, but then they blow right past that and they move into, but they were so heroic, and we need, they were canonized basically.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to do is to go back to those women and assume that not all of them, sure, a lot of them were strong and capable women who rose to the challenge, but not all of them did. And the peculiar circumstances of war and deprivation and dislocation meant that the normal networks that would be available for any woman under any circumstances, a widow, for example, who needed to fall back on family, a lot of these social networks were upended, right? They had to fall back on neighbors and kin in times of strife, but they were going through some of the same things. And I think that ratcheted up the feelings of desperation. So you have this narrative in the historical literature. And then you had, I think, the first generation of feminist historians. I'm thinking here mostly of Anne Scott and her book, From Pedestal to Power, The Southern Lady Pedestal to Power, who also talked about how strong these women were. So you had this desire of feminist historians to see the heroic and the strong women, which is understandable. So with, I think, probably Drew Faust's work, we have the first serious interrogation of, and then mostly these are elite women. So we still have to get at middling and poor women. But she's the first one who says these women were sold a bill of goods in the paternalism bargain, that they would be taken care of. And when war came and the men went off to war and they were left with their parcel of children and having to plow, it all fell apart for them. And some of them really never recovered.
Is this, I might be going off script here for a second, but I'm really intrigued by this because after the war and during Reconstruction and all that, and I don't mean to go so far ahead right now, but this is kind of an interesting point because we still hear about it, especially with the lost cause narrative. Is this part of the rise of what would become later the United Daughters of the Confederacy, where you're having the women control that narrative of what women went through during the war? Is that where that comes from?
Well, it actually starts during the war. Okay. So we have the typical memorials to women. In fact, a lot of the Confederate, the literature that was really the in-choate lost cause ideology, they were starting to turn this idea that it was the women who held the country together, and it was the failing of the men who didn't do their jobs, who didn't hold up their end of the bargain. So you actually see this being played out during the war. And then, of course, it gets fed into the memorial efforts and then into organizations like the UDC by these Confederate descendants who take the reins of the narrative and don't allow for women like Sarah Neese or Sarah Garrett to have a place. And what I was trying to do in my book was to recover the lives of these women, not to say that they were typical or that they were, I don't want to make them victims, but to just say that there was a larger experience for women on the Confederate home front. And it's important to have all of these women included.
Yeah, and John, I would add too, part of this just naturally happens. When you remember experiences in war and you're sharing your own experiences, rarely do you want to share your worst moments or what you might feel like were your worst moments, right? When you talk to students about, yes, it's Mary Chestnut's diary, but you have to realize it's been edited. And you think about if people could just basically publish all of your tweets for the last 10 years, you might want to take a few things out too, right? So part of this just kind of naturally, there's almost this self-filtering. And part of the thing I was thinking about, Diane, And Steph, too, is that, when we look at the stories people share and the accounts that get shared, they usually are going to be the accounts of the elites who might have more of a buffer. And that's one of the amazing things about these governor collections is, you can hear from Sarah Neese from 1864, who is fuming about these guys who just came and seized her pony for the war effort. She's not even convinced they're actually in the army. And she's like, what am I supposed to do? I've got 3 kids to support and I can't even plow a field.
Right.
And it's also, Diane, you mentioned this great thing too about, I think sometimes, it's all of us want in this kind of modern age, wow, look at what these women were able to do, right? And we love telling the stories of Abigail Adams during the American Revolution, and she's actually running the farm more efficiently than John did.
Right.
But we forget sometimes that, but they didn't necessarily want to do that. And that was not necessarily their goal. And it's what's in place to support them is not much. I mean, one of the things we've been noticing on the team, Lindsay Peterson pointed this out, is how quickly, I'm talking June of 1861, mothers are writing in asking for their sons to be recused from military service. He enlisted, he's not even 18, I'm a widow, you need to send him home. So this isn't kind of as war pressure builds, it's immediate. And the other thing is how quickly people are needing aid. It's almost like there's no buffer. One of my grad students who studied kind of assistance for military families on the Mississippi home front, she noticed that in some counties in Mississippi, the police boards who provide that assistance during this time period, they're starting to provide aid by August of 1861. I mean, it's very, very quick that families are they're just becoming just destitute because, again, I think you didn't have that buffer. And if we're only looking at some of the more elite records, you're not running into it like you can when you get into the governor's records because everybody wrote to the governor.
Right.
It's fascinating what's coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that demographically, it's important to understand that there probably what would be my guess is if you look at these women, they're probably either widows or they're very young mothers, right? So that makes sense that they would be in peril much earlier. Bob Kinzer has this great older but very, very timeless study of Orange County, North Carolina, in which he talks about the high percentages of Virginia women who are actually widowed and they're young, and the majority of the soldiers and their wives have married in the 1850s. So when they go off to war, they have very little. They don't have a nest egg. They were just starting out. So when you have maybe a marriage that's only been a few years old, maybe one child or two, very, very small children, these are not children who can help the mother. They are not able to go out and plow into the fields like the older women could do. And then, of course, the widows become another class that in my book, I see that they suffer emotionally at very, very high rates.
Steph, we see a lot of these women writing in, as we've been saying, to assert their rights, basically, and to say that, hey, this is something has been wronged, that I've been treated unfairly. I feel that I need to have compensation. And it seems like a lot of these women are from different strata economically. One of them, though, that really struck out to me was Sarah Garrett, saying that, I think it was 1864. She's some of the people who she has enslaved, she just lets them go and work as tradesmen. And the Mississippi apparently doesn't like that and wants to clap down on that. And then you see other women who are from the yeoman class writing in and still doing, as we've been saying, asserting their rights. What were some of the people, some of these women who really struck out to you, who were like, they're not afraid to ask and seek what they need?
Yeah. One of the people that I did background research for this podcast that poor Susanna's had to listen to me talk about many times because there's just something about her. In one of the people that I'm most interested in looking in is Caroline Burns. Caroline Burns is about a middle-aged woman. She actually enters the Civil War as a widow. Her husband dies in the 1850s, and she is a tavern owner in Starkville. And she actually, in the 1860 census, Caroline was doing pretty decently. I couldn't find a slave schedule to see if she had any enslaved individuals, but she certainly had a high property and a high personal value in the census. And she was a tavern owner. And of course, going up to, am I wrong, Susanna? 1864 is when she writes the governor, or is it
1865? It's right after the war, right? because it's a tax that basically gets passed on wartime earnings.
Yeah, so she's upset that she's about to get taxed, and she owns this tavern, and she actually writes to the governor, and she says something to the effect, she's like, I can't pay any of my bills, much less taxes. I have this tavern. I'm not making ends meet. I feel like I'm going to lose everything. And she's been running this place by herself long before the war started. So she is kind of an independent businesswoman who's been making things work. All of her older children, it doesn't really look like anyone but one of her daughters is helping her run this tavern. And so she writes them and she says, I can't do anything. Please don't make me pay this tax. And we don't really, do we have a response from the governor on that one, Suzanne?
We don't have a response yet that we've been able to see, but because sometimes there'll be a little notation at the bottom.
Yeah, and there's not one on this.
Right, but the thing that I've loved about this one is, she makes it very clear that, by the way, I have paid my taxes annually, on time, in full, that I'm a good businesswoman. It's been it's a rough year kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But Susanna, what she also says is, and this probably of all of the sample cases that you shared with me, she said she bolsters her case by saying that she has been she has paid her dues in the past and fulfilled the responsibilities and duties of a good citizen.
Yeah.
You don't have women referring to themselves as citizens.
Oh gosh.
Right? So before the war, citizens were men.
Diane, how did I miss that? That is fantastic.
If you look at, like, Stephanie McCurry talks about this, and she says, really, like, they because her argument is that the war gives these women a political identity and a political voice. They don't call themselves citizens or anything like that, but this woman does. So I think that's particularly telling about her expectation is that, she has sacrificed and this government owes her. And she has done everything that has been asked of her as a good citizen.
Yep.
Yeah, I've never even considered that. So that's.
I know. This is a fantastic find.
Yeah, that's fantastic. The other thing that I wanted to think about was Unionist sentiment among some of the women themselves, and we see this in some points going through the documents. Was it an early thing, or do we see women who are just sick of this whole endeavor and they're like, I wish this never would have happened, we need to face facts or whatever else? Because we do see it with some of the men in the ranks. Do we see it with the women who are on the home front saying, A, I didn't like it in the first place, or B, just get this done and over with, and let's I want him to come home, or I want my compensation from the government.
So far, and I need to kind of do that with the asterisks there. We're about 2,000 docs in, but so far what we're seeing is more dissent, frustration than overt kind of political positioning of pro-union sentiment from women in the documents. It's a lot more about the challenges and the tensions and the burdens that are being caused by the war effort. Mm-hmm. So I would categorize it much more as dissent than overt unionism. But you do, I mean, dissent can be a powerful thing, though, right? Where you see some of these documents where Confederate officers are writing in, they're like, we're trying to round up these deserters in Madison County, and nobody is helping us. They basically are siding with the deserters. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily overt unionism that you're seeing in these cases, as much as they're clearly not seeing the purpose of the Confederate war effort, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was an interesting point that we made about a year ago on a live stream. I was talking to Dr. Peter Carmichael about his latest book, and he talks about one of the deserters from a North Carolina unit after Gettysburg. And he's basically receiving letters from home, saying about how hard it is back home. But then his brother is also killed with him on Culp's Hill, and he has to take his brother's body home, and he never comes back. He's like, I'm just done, and everything else. He goes back to the Army later on, is shot for desertion with like 12 other people at the time. And according to him, then in layman's terms, one of the newspapers in Richmond basically says, the women are writing to these guys saying how hard it is back on the home front. We need to figure out how to stop this. And basically blamed, quote unquote, some of the women for that, telling them how hard it was, like in North Carolina or whatever other state there may be on that. And it really kind of stuck out to me because it shows the power of the women back home, when even the media at the time sometimes slips and puts it into the newspaper, that the editorials they're mad about this whole thing. And they're putting in there that they're basically, quote, blaming the women on the home front for not being strong enough at times. And that's a really striking thing to think when they have no political power at the polling place, but they have political pull at home. And
oh yeah, I mean, this is what Stephanie McCurry talks about in her book, and Ann Rubin got into it. Amy Taylor has the idea that women wind up having enough power to demand county and state level support that was promised, but wasn't actually being delivered. And yet they're going to be able to create enough pressure to do this. You can see Senator Wigfall saying the same thing about Texas families back home, that, the women need to cut it out. But you also see this in times of war, period, right? I mean, this is why we have censorship, with military males, is that, the male, let's not say too much. It's partly about security, but it's also partly about morale. Yeah. So, and it's just, this is why wars are not fun. It very quickly goes from a moment of dramatic heights of almost this kind of patriotic fervor to the brutal reality of what war is and what war demands of people. And you see this very quickly, I think, in almost kind of every war I've studied. Mm-hmm. What's different, though, is I think the ability to let us hear it from people who you don't traditionally hear from, right? It's not that, we talked about this before. It's not that they've been silenced. It's just you can't get to all the voices. You can't hear all of them. Mm-hmm. And when you can start to make these readily available and you can easily search through them, you're really going to start to hear and be able to uncover things that we really hadn't understood before.
Right. And that's the power of the project, right? Is that, Steph, you're going through all these documents and you're looking at them and they're being scanned and they're being transcribed, and you could literally see the strata of different citizenry at that time, if you will. And you're not just reading the Mary Chestnuts, and you're not just reading these other women's diaries, which just happen to be published. These are letters like we would send today to an elected official, like an email, and you're not going to write that the same way you're going to write a memoir.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that I'm most interested to see as this project progresses, we kind of talked last week about, the introduction of secession and, how people were kind of rallying around the early Civil War. And we've only digitized the first handful of these documents. I mean, handful is still a lot, but out of 20,000, we still have a way to go. Right. I'm going to be interested to see, just because, writing your governor wasn't necessarily commonplace, but it was something that you may do more more than once or twice in your entire life. And I'm interested to see, you know, if or whether or not we do have Mrs. J.O. Smith make an appearance again, who she was Our Lady from Vicksburg last week. Once again, came into the Civil War widowed. And she was a nurse and asking to be shipped to Virginia because she wanted to serve as a nurse and had a bunch of other widowed nurse friends who wanted to join her and was asking how she could get there. And I think it's going to be kind of interesting to see as we go through these documents and we transcribe more. Do we hear from Mrs. Smith again? You know, are they still kind of rallying behind this cause that they were in 1861? Is she going to pop back up, say, in Reconstruction, writing the governor? And is, you know, how's she feeling about the cause, you know, at that point? Yeah. So I think that's something that we're going to be able to do with this collection that is invaluable.
Yeah, because you've gone through 10%.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. And I don't think, I mean, have we, Suzanne, at this point found many duplicates of citizens, not necessarily military officials or political officials?
I mean,
Yeah.
Mary Jones.
Yeah, Mary Jones.
And I love that in the second, you know, she's just getting increasingly frustrated. You know, I try to get assistance as a military widow in Natchez, and they keep telling me that because I came down from Yazoo City, I've got to go there. But you told me to go to Jackson. I went to Jackson. You know, it's just this, oh my gosh, will somebody help this poor woman? Her second letter, though, it ends with this. I was thinking about a lot of what you were talking about in your book, Diane. It ends with this very, she's very much part of this patriarchy, right? Where she's seeing the governor, she's positioning him almost like this father figure who needs to protect her. Sarah Hogue, one of our grad students, was the first one to kind of note that as we were working with that document, that it's almost like she's frustrated and she's being forceful, and then she's kind of pulling back on it, in part because maybe she does not want the responsibilities that are on her, but also because this is how she operates. This is how her world works. The men are supposed to protect her. And, you know, her father is a judge in Alabama. I mean, she looks like she was potentially well off. Her husband, Steph, didn't you find he was an overseer, if I remember right?
Yeah, he was an overseer.
Yeah, in Natchez, and you know, they don't have their property and real estate values, but they do have all the neighbors around them were very affluent people. And so you would think, you know, she had some connections, but she does not seem to. And so she falls back on this needing to be protected and basically calling on the governor to protect her.
I definitely think that one of the themes that jumps out at me is that these women have an expectation that the Confederacy owes them. They say, in fact, it was Mary Jones who talks about her husband who had sacrificed himself, and it's very poignant. They did not tell my dear husband that I should beg from door to door when he went to fight for his country. No, he sacrificed everything he had. So she is saying, you owe me. My husband gave you his life.
Yeah.
And now you have to take care of me. And one of the questions I had was, I wondered whether these women actually drove the states to develop policies of social welfare, or whether they were in place. I couldn't divine that from the letters, but I wondered if they were actually the driving force behind some of these relief efforts.
I think you can definitely say that. I can't speak for, you know, every southern state, but I mean, if you look at Mississippi and how aid is provided at the time, it was the county level matter. It was handled by the local police boards, and they basically kind of would visit your house and see what your condition was and decide if you needed help. By the way, for folks listening, if you ever want to see those records, Family Search has a lot of those. They've all been digitized. They're not keyword searchable yet. So you got to go in by county and then just, you know, keep clicking as you leaf your way through it. But, you know, it's those boards. And then all of a sudden, you know, this is going to be something that has to be provided at the state level. I mean, it's just too much to handle at the county level, right? And we've seen scholars talk about, and then, you know, for the North, this very much becomes part of a federal process of, you know, providing care. And absolutely, I think you can definitely credit women as being this kind of driving force in a very empathetic cause, because it's as powerful today as it was then. Of, you know, if you're going to ask people to go and make these sacrifices, there's certain responsibilities that, you know, the state and people have to them.
And so one of the questions I think that more documents later on in your period will show or not is the extent to which this politicization of women, this new relationship that they have with the state, has longevity. How does that translate into the post-war years? Do they all fall back and it's business as usual, or is it transformed into some kind of other kind of agency? Is it, in fact, I mean, part of the lost cause, the UDC? Is that how they channel their advocacy?
Right. I think some of it's what you talk about too, Diane, where it's they can't fall back because so many of the men either don't come home or they come home, but with injuries that prevent them from, you know, providing as they had before the war. And so whether women want to maintain this kind of engaged role, at least if not in politics, at least economically, it's whether or not they want to do it, they have to do it. And they're having to kind of restructure families, you know, kind of combine, you know, sisters and children living together, you know, but it's one of the things that I'm the most interested in these documents is this whole thing about, well, and then the war ends, the men come home and the women go back into the household. I'm like, that just doesn't happen when you have 750,000 casualties, you know, or excuse me, deaths. And then you have more from wounded and missing. So, you know, I think what we're going to find is a lot of Caroline Burns. Steph, I'm trying to remember the woman in Vicksburg. You know, she's basically selling cakes and pies. You know, she's like, look, I've long since sold off all my jewelry.
Yeah.
You know, and again, it's one of the tax complaints. She's like, you know, my tax is higher than my entire store is worth. And, you know, and she has people documenting this for her and all that. But again, I don't know that she wanted to remain engaged as a breadwinner, but she has to. She has no other choice.
I was wondering about that too, with the devastating loss of life. You said 750,000 deaths. That's not including people who were maimed or anything like that. Coming home, and I immediately went to the World War II era, because it's like you hear about women in the workforce, and then they move supposedly back to home and become home builders and all that stuff. And it seems like you can't really do that when a whole town is basically takes 80% casualties in the war as far as the male population is concerned. You're not holding that job for someone to come home to now. You have to take that job or that position on the farm or whatever it may be. Plus, they lose their enslaved population. They're no longer enslaved. They're freed peoples now. So someone has to go out and work in that way too. So not only do you have the loss of the white male population, you have the loss of that as well. And so the economy needs to be rebuilt. And hence, well, this is Reconstruction 101. But, you know, kind of like there's no real way to hold a place for the man to come back to and say, okay, here's your old job or here's whatever, because they're either dead, maimed, or something else.
Right. And if you think too about kind of the way the world in which they live has totally changed. I mean, if you think about how important marriage is, right? And the protections, not to mention the burdens, but the protections that kind of come with marriage in the society when you have such a devastating loss of the male population, right? I mean, I was just talking with our British historian this week who was talking about what were called surplus women after the First and Second World Wars, because, you know, there's all these women at home and these men, and the women are not marrying. They're not entering the life that they were raised to enter. And that their society is really kind of structured around. And so it's interesting when you think about how many challenges they're going to have to navigate in this totally upended world. And then one of the other things that I'm really hoping we're going to be able to investigate is now, how does this play out for African-American women? There are very few, you know, free Blacks in Mississippi before and during the Civil War. The vast majority of the African-American population is enslaved. And, you know, how is this transition going to happen for freed women? and kind of how are they going to be able to navigate this? And again, because their world, is just as upended and even more with all of these, Jubilee-like opportunities, and yet a heck of a lot of burdens.
Mm-hmm. Wouldn't there be a trust divide there post-war where newly freed peoples are like, I don't know if I could trust this system just yet, so I'm not writing to the governor, I'm not writing to the government of the state, or they may just leave, and that may leave a hole in the research.
Or it depends on who's governor. If it's if it's a Union general like Adelbert Ames, they might write him, right? It's the Union officer. This is the son-in-law of Benjamin Butler, so maybe they'll write him. Diane, you had commented earlier that we can also piece together records from the Southern Claims Commission, Freedmen's Bureau records, Freedmen Bank records. There's ways to get at this. And so my dream long-term is to be able to connect governors' projects like ours, like the one that's being built in Alabama right now and Kentucky, but also to connect those with like the Smithsonian's efforts to transcribe the Freedmen's Bureau projects. So, could we, do searches for the people in our collection and see what the Freedmen's Bureau records are pulling up as well?
Hey, we're trying that with subject tagging. So that's something we might be able to do soon. Yeah, one of the things that we do at CWRGM is not only do we transcribe everything, but we subject tag everything with Library of Congress subject tagging protocols. So at least we are using a lot of the same subject tags that other projects are doing. And so hopefully one day we'll be able to cross-reference with other major projects.
That's what really interests me as well. The subject tagging is huge with digitization because it streamlines everything, and you can get right to the heart of the matter very quickly. It's accessible. Everyone wants to have quick accessibility right now because we're used to getting it on the phone and thumbing through it literally and finding what we need. So digital history and digital humanities in general has really revolutionized this process, which I'm so glad that many people are going to be able to help out with the project. And I hope many people here in the chat and listening on the podcast later on go to the website, because they're going to need help with all these documents with transcribing and all that. And as I said last week, I always keep my reading glasses handy because some of these letters, wow. I mean, it's just crazy. But being able to see the primary source for the first time and being able to give it light and have the ability to put it on the world stage, literally on the website, that's a huge endeavor, not only in time, but it's a huge endeavor for legacy of the state and these people of the state. What has this experience been like to put these women on the world stage for the first time? Because these women have maybe never been heard before, or maybe only a couple because someone found them in an archive. This is a totally different ballgame now with digital humanities. How has that been personally for you in this project? And I'll let anyone take this, because you all have worked with primary sources, you all have worked with digital resources, and I'm the only man on the panel tonight, so I'm going to sit back and listen.
Good job.
Yeah, I would say, John, I mean, one of the things with the subject tagging that really drove that effort was to help find people who aren't going to easily be found, right? So these are usually kind of all your they're going to be in the lower economic classes. They're going to be marginalized for one reason or another. And so we started creating these tags that would help you find, military families, would help you find widows that are going to collect the documents tied to lunatic asylums. It also offers kind of suggested phrasing so that when students are using these terminologies and you see 19th century words that, are just not acceptable, they're immediately going to have this pop-up cue. This is the acceptable word. And if you click on this, you can find all sorts of additional documents connected to this at the same time. So, I mean, it became, my first book was on Irish Catholics in the Union Army and understanding kind of the motivations behind their military service. And that's another group that it's really hard to find records that aren't military records or letter collections from soldiers. When I was trying to get into, but what happens to their families? Again, this is just something I tend to work in, what happens to the family as a result of these heroic or these sacrificing or these dramatic stories that we are drawn toward. You don't want to forget the cost that is involved in that. And part of it, comes from, kind of coming from a military family background, but also just wanting to find these experiences that you can't find. And so, yeah, it feels incredibly good to be able to be part of something that's not only going to get this stuff up online, but get it online in a really organized way so that people can actually make sense of it and find what they need to find. Like if you're interested in what happens to the criminal justice system during the war, like who is getting charged, what happens during Reconstruction, like who's getting charged for what, and how do the charges differ based on race, based on gender, based on class, we're going to be able to help people kind of quickly sort through that. So yeah, it feels really good.
And I would say, I would make 2 points. And one of them is that for me, I teach undergraduates in a research seminar, and having digital sources available to them is just so critical. They would never be able to do any primary research in Mississippi, right? But now I'm going to be able to point them when I teach my Civil War seminar for them, that they're going to be able to go to these records and learn a little bit about Mississippi and its history. The second thing I would say is that for me, I have a penchant for doing social history. I really enjoy uncovering the lives of men and women who aren't elites, who don't hold office, who don't author memoirs. And so this is a wonderful access point to read about Mary Jones and Sarah Neese. These are women who, this may be the only point in the historical record, the official record, where they've left a thumbprint. So I think for me, that's the real, one of the great aspects of this project and others like it, is that we can see what it's like among the middling folk. And we learn about what their struggles are like and how those differ from those of the elites.
Steph, how about you?
Oh, I'm just saying, especially with my students, because right now, like I told you last week, I'm teaching a Humanities 402 502 class that have strictly been working with CWRGM documents. And as a professor, it's actually been a lot of fun to watch them kind of discover/rediscover the Civil War era in Mississippi, because a lot of the letters that they've been working with so far, the few that they've come into contact with have already complicated their notions of what the Civil War meant in the state, what they were taught in high school. I know the majority of the students that I have in my class were born and raised in Mississippi. So this has been a fantastic opportunity for them to see, via social history from, people's own mouths, from women's own mouths, what their experiences are during the war and how they felt when secession happened. And so, beyond a digital perspective, from an educational perspective, it's been fascinating to see the light bulb go off and realize, sometimes grand narratives are a little too grand. And this is what real life was actually like. And the students are already responding to it. And it's been phenomenal.
And Steph, I mean, with your work with loyalists during the American Revolution, again, these are the kind of the portions of the population that, as people are making the decisions of what to preserve, these are usually the records that do not get preserved. It's either a story that people don't maybe want remembered, or they just view it as it's just not important. And so the crazy thing with these governor's records is that, Mississippi, mandated for the state archive to really preserve these. It was actually kind of part of a lost cause effort. This critically important story of the Confederacy, and in the process, they're actually helping us dismantle the lost cause.
Irony lives.
Yeah. Especially the women's letters. Yeah, especially the women's letters.
Yeah, but it's also letting you hear from people who are a lot more maybe like you than what we traditionally hear from, because it's elites who preserve the records, or others value their stories. But I've often said it's so the much more common experiences are going to be from the middle and the lower classes. So this is really going to let you hear from those experiences.
Yeah, and someone like me who's full-time digital historian in a different vein, doing it via social media, doing it via live streams and other places. This opens so many doors for people like me who are trying to get the information quickly to disseminate it out to a large audience in a quick manner, who are seeking it very easily and want it put in layman's terms, basically, if I can use that term, because, it's reaching a very diverse audience. And so when you have all this stuff digitized, it's like you could showcase the digitized record and then be like, what's this backstory behind this, and why, who's the audience that this letter is supposed to be going to? Because when you're reading a memoir, it's for a certain audience. When you're reading this letter, it's for a different audience.
Yeah.
And how does that coincide? It's almost like running a classroom, on social media, in that way, where you allow people to really think and get outside their comfort level. And I can't imagine, when you're in the classroom, like Steph just said, with someone who's learned this time period a certain way, and then all of a sudden you put all these documents in front of them, and you're like, well, hold it. This is what people like you and I were saying, whether they're serving in the military, or they're women on the home front, or whoever may be, someone who was a freedman after the war. It has to be just jaw-dropping for a new generation of historians, because this project is going to impact, and others like it are going to impact so many other generations to come.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of my dreams is that, you can take a county in Mississippi and, okay, here's the Confederate monument, and here's what it says on the Confederate monument. Now look at all these letters that came in from that county during the war. And, if you do it, for example, where we are, where I am in Forest County, there's this, number one, there was no Forest County during the war, but it's okay. It's basically people of the region. It's a classic monument, the noble sacrifice, basically everybody doing what they needed to do for the cause, that completely ignores the fact of, Jones County right next door, actually portions of it, of not only dissent, but kind of armed internal revolution of, these documents from the women who, we're not just doing the noble sacrifice. There is a lot of anger and a lot of demands. And so I would love to see school groups, whether it's, secondary students or college and university students, public, community groups, get in there and get into these county level records and kind of look at how the war gets publicly remembered, and then try and unravel, okay, what happened? Like, how did that memory get so convoluted along the way?
Yeah. Couldn't you imagine putting these primary sources next to the speeches that were given at the monument dedication, and being like, spot the differences? It'd be really interesting to see that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's fantastic. I really appreciated the story of the Bonnet Brigade women, because it's like they want equal pay for equal work, and it's like, that's fantastic. 1961, we're thinking about this. Let's do it.
I know. I think we're going to have to add the Nightingale Regiment to the sample documents.
Yeah, Nightingale Regiment. I really enjoyed that. That's fantastic. Any last words about this particular part of the project at all? And I'll go around one more time, because this is fascinating to me, because I've mainly studied the men at the front and heard of the home front stuff, and I've recently learned within the last 5 to 10 years about how women at home could change the course of desertion rates and stuff like that. And I've been just fascinated by it, and now thinking about how we're going to go into Reconstruction with it is even more fascinating to me, because as we've said in previous live streams, it's been tough to get the Reconstruction stuff even out there into the traditional sphere of the history world, especially when it comes to public schools. So this would be a brand new thing for a lot of us. Is there something that, really stands out for the Reconstruction era, perhaps, where you're thinking about maybe claims of damage from the war or something like that, where the women are the ones writing in and saying, I have the power now to get this done, and I need this done?
Right. So we're definitely seeing so far, and again, remember, we're just kind of picking out some sample documents of the Reconstruction period. But what we are seeing are those kind of demands that, that I can't pay this tax. You've got to be kidding me. The other thing that I've been noticing in some of the post-war documents is just the number of widows being referenced. The shooting took place near the widow Wilson's house. This took place near widow so-and-so's house. And I'm curious to see, again, this sense of, just how revolutionized these women's lives have been by the deaths of so many of these men. But I don't know. We're going to have to dig in to see, well, I don't know, he might have actually died a year or two, earlier. I think the parts where the documents are helping us challenge the historiography and maybe forward what we think we know is, again, the very early demand for assistance, and the very almost immediate demand for men to be sent home. Basically, it's a lot of mothers, a lot of widowed mothers with sons that, I told him not to enlist. He went ahead and did it anyway. You need to send him home, kind of a thing. So those are a couple of the spots where I'm going to be curious, to learn more. And the last thing I would just add is, as a military historian who absolutely spends a lot of time on battlefields where we're writing about them or walking them with folks, one of the important things to remember when you study soldiers at war is how that we are looking at them on the battlefield, but they are looking home. When you look at their letters, they're interested in getting home. They're interested in what's happening at home. It's 90% boredom and frustration that they can't get home. And so if you don't study the home front when you're studying war, you're missing about 90% of that story. And I would certainly argue it's over half of the story, and it's an important one to understand.
I would suggest that there's probably two areas where you're going to find some good documentation for in the post-war period. One is nationalism, and I know you have Ann Rubin coming up in a couple of weeks, but that was the other thing that was running through these documents was, okay, now that we know that these women are challenging the Confederacy, what does that say about their commitment to nation? There's a very healthy debate about this. So I think that you'll get more evidence that will help us answer questions about the level of their commitment to their nation. But also, I think you're going to find more evidence of conflict with African Americans. So whether it's I had done some work with the Kentucky Governor's Project, and there were so many court cases that were held either during the war or right after the war. And then after the war, there's letter writing campaigns. There's petitions to lessen a penalty or a fine or to get somebody out of jail. And they use the circumstances of war and loyalty and traitors to try to leverage that. So I think that you're probably going to find an awful lot of wrangling and conflict, but also contests over African Americans and labor, and there's going to be violence, and how is that prosecuted?
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about some of that next week as we look at kind of the process of emancipation and the violence in that early post-war period. One of the documents we'll look at next week has to do with the shooting of an African-American man by the son of the freedman's previous owner. And, this kind of struggle for power on the same land where he is now working as a laborer, where he had been enslaved. And, the murder, and what we've been trying to dig in is to find out what happened to the son. Did he get prosecuted for this?
Yeah.
What was the penalty? And those are going to be those cases, kind of like that Diane's talking about, that we can dig into.
Awesome. I just put up the link in the chat for everyone who is here with us as we're wrapping up to get involved with the project. And Susanna, do you want to give them just a short burst of what they can do to help this project out? I placed the website into both the chats on Facebook and YouTube.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Yeah, basically, if you want to get involved, you go to CWRGM.org and you click on Get Involved. And there's a quick little 13-minute training video on, transcriptions and the weird things of 19th century writing, like the double S that looks like an FS, and these types of things to help you out. And then it just takes you to what's called From the Page, which is an online transcription service where you can find all of our documents and you can help transcribe. We are running a little bit low on documents right now because of COVID restrictions at the state archives. kept them from being able to send us as many documents as they had planned. And I want to make it very clear to everybody that our colleagues at the State Archives have been working like crazy. This is COVID. When you can't even let people in the building, it's going to create a slowdown. But we're supposed to be getting another huge batch in June. So if you want to go and help us now, awesome. If you go and there aren't a lot of documents that you want to work on, but you want to, come back to us in June, come back in June. We are going to need the help.
Yes. I have one question from the audience. Do you need to be in Mississippi to help? No.
No.
From anywhere in the world.
As long as you have internet access, you can access the records. And please, I think the thing that is just so fun about volunteers getting involved is, we have a volunteer transcriber in Wales. We just have people from all over who are just interested in this. And you don't have to have a history background, y'all. All you have to do is basically be able to read cursive. And John's right. It's not always beautiful cursive when they talk about, in the old days they taught handwriting. I'm like, but not everybody's as beautiful.
Or it bleeds through from the other side, and then the other side's going a different direction.
Yep.
Oh no!
Yep. Or they run out of paper and they start writing this way, and
yes, have a lot of Tylenol on hand for those headaches. That's
exactly.
But it's definitely worth it. I would never say that to talk you out of it.
No,
it is worth it. It is totally worth it.
And remember, as a volunteer, you get to move on to the next document if you don't like the one you picked. It's the student researchers who have to stay and keep working on the hard documents. So you can always pick a different one.
That's right. And hey, any students out there want to get involved, that can go on your resume.
That's right.
Volunteer work. So bump up that resume. Well, thank you all for being on here. Diane, thank you for coming on and
my pleasure
time with us. It's been wonderful. Susanna, thank you for another wonderful week here on the live stream. Stephanie has fallen by the wayside. Her battery died on the laptop, but I want to thank her as well. She's probably going to see that later and understand that she's been thanked.
Yeah, but Diane, I just want to thank you too. We wanted you on this episode for exactly the insights that you brought tonight. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for it's an honor to have you think of me.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you, John. Fun night.
Thank you, everyone on the panel, and thank you, everyone on Facebook and on YouTube. It's been a pleasure for me to do this panel because of being the only male on the panel. Last year, I saw a live stream where there were 4 males and 1 female talking about women's history. So this is great. Let's keep flipping the script, ladies and gentlemen, and doing it right. But thank you all for tuning in. I hope you had a wonderful evening. Please be safe out there. We're going to be back on next week, same time, same channels, kind of like Batman. And we'll be talking about the next episode, episode 3 of 5. And if you are so interested, this will be a podcast dropping next Wednesday. So if you missed part of it and you don't have time to watch, you can listen on Spotify, iTunes, and Amazon Music. So again, thank you everyone for being with us this evening. We will see you next week.
Good night, everybody.